back. Thursday night, and another busy night. Lots and lots to report. We'll get as much in here as we can in the next 3 hours. And then tomorrow, Friday, and then a weekend. But it's not going to slow down any. Just watch. First up tonight, Dr. Henry Niman. And Henry has a busy plate tonight. Hello, Henry. Welcome back. How are you back there?
Hello, Jeff. Good to be back. Things are fine here. And like
Good.
you said, it's a little busy on the science front. So,
Yeah.
But I thought I'd do some updates tonight.
Well, for you newcomers to the program, Henry has been with us for, 15 years now, Henry? I don't know, a long time. Something like that.
At least track, right?
Yeah. He is, without question, one of the world's foremost and highly respected virologists. He is a genetic expert, and that's a field we'll talk about tonight as well. We have other things on the table, not in the news at all. Measles. And every week, a new record seems to be being set here in the country, but you never know it by looking at the mainstream media. So what do you want to start with tonight, Henry?
Oh, I thought we'd start with Ebola. There's some pretty significant updates on the scientific front, and I thought that one would be a good place to start. This is really, the news is really on the spread in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they've had an outbreak there. I think it's getting close to a year now. And there are a whole lot of issues with getting it under control. I think it's now the second largest outbreak reported to date. It's still only about 10% of the one in West Africa several years ago. But it's
about 1,900 reported dead so far, as opposed to 18,000 the last time around 2 years ago. Yeah. Right.
So it's not as big as that one, but it is bigger than all the other ones. I mean, it used to be if they had 100 to 300 cases, that was certainly made the news, and that was among the highest. But this is, closing in on 2,000. And part of it, I think, is the U.S. used to contribute quite a bit to getting these outbreaks under control, especially the one that was 18,000. And they're not contributing as much. And one of the issues with getting it under control early is identifying the cases and doing the contact tracing, and to make sure that contacts basically get quarantined, at least stay at home, and
what is
get
the
monitored to avoid.
What's the normal contact regimen for Ebola? What are they saying? And the measles, for that matter, too. We'll get there.
Well, with Ebola, it's usually coming into contact with bodily fluids, and the people that get very sick end up with a high concentration of virus in these fluids, and sometimes. And
that's a sneeze or a cough, isn't it, Henry? That's any liquid, right? Any liquid.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's people bleed as hemolytic, and so the highest concentration is going to be in the blood, and that's probably where most of the spread comes from. So people that are being cared for at home transmitted to family members. Sometimes it gets transmitted during burial ceremonies. And there's, that's how it kind of moves around. And if cases are identified and the family members, the contacts are identified, it also tends to infect healthcare workers. And again, that's in part because the people that ended up at the hospital have the highest concentration of the virus, and so it's fairly easy to transmit, and it's not so much as it's not really transmitting through the air; it's being transmitted because they're coming in contact with.
You said something a moment ago. we should elaborate upon just a bit. The tradition in many African cultures and countries is to bury the dead in a hands-on fashion, and it's rather tragically ironic. You're burying the dead, and the way they do it, they're creating more dead. They're spreading, in many cases, Ebola. It's bizarre. They're just back there. They're not up to date. And they'd rather honestly keep doing what they do. From what I read, they go to the shamans. They don't want to go to these Ebola treatment centers. Sometimes they stay away. And we know what happens to many of these treatment centers, which are really nothing more than plastic enclosed tent areas and cots for the most part. But they still get looted and burned down and broken up by some of these political factions that are fighting all the time. It's not a good situation over there.
Right. And that's kind of, one of the causes of the spread is there is, political unrest and there's some mistrust of doctors and so there are those issues normally with just controlling it. Now, what makes it so remarkable that it's continuing to grow, and like I say, the second highest, is there is a vaccine, and there's actually a couple vaccines that have already gone through initial phases of clinical trials and have been shown to be quite effective. And one of them is made by Merck, and it's got an advantage that it only takes one shot. The other one that's in use now is by Johnson & Johnson that requires 2 shots. And they're kind of using it like they've used to combat other infectious diseases like the smallpox that's been eliminated. And they do it with a technique that's called, kind of ring vaccination. And
right.
And so they identify where the virus is, and then they kind of vaccinate people within a certain radius of that who are likely to be contact. And by choosing those people, they end up preventing the virus from spreading because those people end up having antibodies a couple of weeks after they've been vaccinated, and that way they can control it. But like I said, there hasn't been that much support, so it's kind of like they kind of get the area or the contacts vaccinated with one outbreak, and then it manages to kind of get out of that one localized area and moves to another one, and then it pops up again. And so, in part because they're not able to really do the contact tracing that they should be doing, it's hard to keep it in one localized area, and therefore, even though they vaccinate a lot of contacts, they've got to kind of start over again when it gets out of that one localized area. And as a result, they ran out of vaccine. So Merck is making more, and they said they'll have more vaccine in 2020. And
is that an attenuated? Is it an attenuated or dead in those vaccines? Do we know?
It's vaccine. It's dead. They're not going to be using a attenuted Ebola virus. So,
and you said one of the vaccines, the Merck vaccine, is very effective. You said, do we really have data on that?
Yeah, they're talking about being close to 100% effective. So the issue is really getting enough people vaccinated, as well as the reason Merck is superior to J&J is J&J takes two shots, and I think they're about a month apart, and so whereas the Merck would be effective a couple of weeks after, the J&J would be like 6 weeks after. So 6 weeks is a long time when you're trying to get the virus under control, and so as a result, there is the J&J vaccine's available, but the Merck isn't available right now. And so, like I said, they kind of get the virus under control in the area that they vaccinate, but then I don't know the exact numbers. I think it's like they vaccinated maybe 100,000 people already. So they've been vaccinated a lot, but the virus has moved around, and so they haven't really got it under control. So a press conference was called this week to announce the results of a clinical trial that involves 4 different agents used to actually treat the patients. So in this case, instead of vaccinating people that have not been infected and having them protected, several weeks afterwards, this is for people that did get infected, and they give them 3 out of the 4 they tested are actually monoclonal antibodies, and the antibodies are developed from people that have had the virus and successfully controlled it, and so they can take the part of the antibody that reacts with the virus and kind of turn it into a monoclonal where they can grow as much of it as they want, and then use that antibody that they grow in the lab to treat people that are infected. And the 2 top agents, one's made by Regeneron, is called REGN-EB3, is really a cocktail of 3 different monoclonal antibodies. And then there's a second one that's called MAB for monoclonal antibody 114. That's a single one. And those 2 were so effective that they actually stopped the clinical trial. The other 2 were ZMapp, which was kind of the first one that came out, that you may recall from the prior outbreak that was starting to be used then. And the 4th one is Remdesivir. And just to give you the numbers, to give you an idea, the virus has got a high case fatality rate. So if they took untreated, they get palliative treatment, but not treated with one of these 4 agents, the fatality rate's around 67%. With the Regeneron cocktail, the death rate of the whole population is only 29%. With the single monoclonal antibody 114 is 34%. And then for ZMapp it's 59%, and for the Remdesivir is 53%. So they basically stopped the trial and came to the conclusion that the Regeneron cocktail as well as the 114 were so much better than the other 2 that those 2 were definitely showing significant efficacy. It's more complicated. I just kind of gave you the top line results, but they had divided the patients up into ones that had a low viral load or had been a shorter time period of symptoms, so they got treated earlier. And on those cases where the viral load was lower or they got early treatment, they were getting like 90% recovered. So, but part of this has to do with how quickly people, start getting the antibodies. And it's just like, I've made these analogies before with, things like Tamiflu and flu and how they want you to take it within the first 2 days, and that was how the clinical trial was set up. And it's all, it's all related to the viral load. You get X amount of drug, and if you give it to somebody where it's early and there's not that much virus there, there's enough drug to overcome the virus. If you give it later and there's a lot of virus, you might knock it down, but you might not knock it down to have a significant difference because there's just too much virus for the treatment. So the bottom line is that these 2 antibodies were effective, and they kind of halted the trial because it wasn't that they couldn't really justify giving, cases that had the virus either of the other two arms of the study, because the first two were clearly superior, and so they've actually, I believe, they started using it in the Democratic Republic of Congo now to treat patients, because unlike the vaccine, I guess you can do all of them, but a monoclonal, it kind of grows in culture, and you can get twice as much every 24 hours or so. So I mean, you can grow it up and get a lot of the antibody, and it's not as big of a technical feat to get a lot of antibody to treat the patient. And again, it's a little bit different than the vaccine. You're vaccinating all the contacts and those that are near the contacts and trying to get things under control. Whereas with the monoclonals, you're only giving the monoclonals to people who are already confirmed to have the virus, and so your target population is a lot smaller, and so you don't have as many people that you have to give the drug to, and you can grow the drug, get the drug in higher amounts. And so that was just announced this week, and so I thought it would be worthwhile to give that update, because it's indicating that
very good.
There's another way to kind of get the virus under control, and like I say, the vaccine's very effective, but it's a bigger challenge, because you're giving it to people that have it. You're trying to guess who's going to get the virus, as opposed to treat people that already have the virus.
Well, the good news is you're reporting that the virus is nearly 100% effective. That's remarkable.
Yeah, the vaccine is, but it's like I say, there you have to kind of do the whole population, or at least the whole population near the outbreak, and people still travel, and that's part of the problems. I mean, that's why it was called a.
But still, is that a normal for a vaccine, for a virus like this to be? This is a bad virus to be 100% effective. I think that's pretty remarkable, or even close to 100%.
Well, it's I don't know. It's probably a lot of it has to do with the virus and how quickly the virus changes, and so a vaccine like the flu it's not going to work that well, because the virus changes every season, and it's fairly heterogeneous, and a lot of people have it, and so it kind of depends on the target. The Ebola is it's not like that many people have it, and it's not like it mutates and changes that quickly. And therefore, if you've got a vaccine, because I think the vaccine was made against, I think it might have been made against a virus that was, circulating in West Africa, several years ago. And, and really, that virus was a little bit different than the Democratic Republic of Congo. At least the virus that had circulated prior to it. I'm not sure how the current outbreaks compared to the vaccine target, but it really comes down to how quickly the virus changes. I mean that. And that's probably a pretty good lead-in to the measles story. I mean, the measles, that vaccine is very effective. They use the vaccine actually for 3 different viruses: MMRs, mumps, measles, and rubella. And that's a very effective vaccine. And in fact, I mean, that's why the current outbreak is so remarkable. That using the United States as an example, the U.S. was declared vaccine-free in 2000. I'm sorry, not vaccine, virus-free So measles was considered eliminated from the United States in 2000, and it really has been eliminated from a lot of different countries. In fact, most of the world, and it's because of this one vaccine that's used for 3 different viruses. Pretty much knocks that virus out, and measles is a very contagious virus, but you need about 95% to get effective herd immunity. So you have to about 95% of the population have to be have to have antibodies, whether they got it from a vaccine or they got the virus. Although this has been eliminated, it's not that there's that many people that are immune because they've had the disease now. Most people that are older than born in the 70s or later don't have the virus because they've had the MMR vaccine.
They've had it. Gotcha. All right. Hold on. Second, Henry, we have to pause. We'll come right back with Dr. Henry Niman, Ph.D., in just a couple of minutes. This measles thing is not slowing down. Why? Is it still confined to the target groups you mentioned last time, or is it spreading?
No, it's pretty much still confined. It's really mostly with Orthodox Jewish cases that. Just to give you the updated numbers, the reason it's setting new records each week is because the numbers go up, although it's slowed down a little bit as far as how many new cases they have each week. I mean, the latest week there were only 10 new cases, but it brought the total to 1182. And just to give you an idea, why is it ridiculous that there's that many cases in the United States? That's the highest number since 1992, and the U.S. was declared free of the measles virus in 2000. So 1992, was 8 years before it was virus free, and that has to do with what percentage of the population is vaccinated. So the vaccine was still being rolled out, and it hadn't really gotten to a high enough number that it could just block the virus from spreading, and so it took it was on a decline from 1992 to 2000. And so the numbers that are reported this year are the highest they've been since 1992. So they're clearly above every year since it was under control in 2000. And to give you an idea of the effectiveness, the CDC's got the last since 2010. And if you look at the number of cases reported each year. And like in 2012, there were only 55 cases. In 2010, there were only 63 cases. In 2016, there were 86. So several of these years, it was less than 100 cases. It had the prior record, since the elimination was in 2014 when there were 667 cases, and the next highest was last year when there was 372. So this year is 1182, which is almost as much as the past 10 years combined, and it is heavily concentrated in New York still. Of those 1182. 653 were in New York City, pretty much in Brooklyn, confined to, there are like 4 zip codes have the vast majority of the New York City cases. And then in Rockland County, there's another 290. So if you take those 2 locations in New York, that's 943 out of the 1182. So, it's a good chunk of them are just in those 2 locations in New York. And even outside of New York, many of the outbreaks are also in these Orthodox communities. New Jersey, I know, is. Pennsylvania is. Michigan is. And they all kind of have the same scenario. Somebody basically, took a flight to Israel, which still has a reasonable number of cases, and they got infected and came back to the United States, and then they came in contact with the communities that really don't have a high vaccination rate. So the vaccination rate is low when somebody comes in and brings the virus, and then it starts spreading, and you end up with, I think Michigan has close to 50 cases, and New Jersey, I think, has around 20 cases. And so you start adding these on top of the 943, and, the vast majority of the 1182 are in Orthodox communities that basically...
now, you also mentioned that an air stewardess died.
Correct.
An El Al Airlines stewardess.
Right. She was on flights from Tel Aviv to New York City, and if you recall, you had asked about the case fatality rate, and you asked this several months ago, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and my response back then was that in the United States there really hadn't been any reported deaths, but there was a stewardess who basically had developed the disease, and she was hospitalized, and I think she was in a coma at the time. This was 3 or 4 months ago. And indeed, it's the same stewardess we're talking about. She was actually infected in March. She's 43-year-old mother of 3, and he ended up, it spread to her brain. She had encephalitis and ended up in a coma. So she's been hospitalized for 5 months, and
that's a very sad story.
Just passed away. Yeah. And there have been a few cases in Israel that have died. There have been a lot more in the Philippines. The Philippines was another example where the virus was pretty much under control, and then they had an outbreak with a dengue virus, and what ended up happening is there were a couple different versions, and then those that got the vaccine seemed to be more susceptible to one of the more virulent versions. And so it kind of worked on the target, but there were more severe cases. And then that kind of led to, kind of a major upsurge of anti-vaccine groups, and they basically got people to stop taking vaccines for everything, including the measles. And then it went from being under control to being out of control in several different areas in the Philippines. And they have, I think the number is like somewhere around 30,000 cases, and they were, I think, running at about 4 deaths every day there. And so, they went from 0 deaths to 4 a day, and it's basically because they stopped taking the vaccine instead of having, like I said, you need about a 95% vaccination rate, and they got the vaccination rate down to, I think, around 68%. And so at that level, the virus spreads because it doesn't spread if you've been vaccinated. Although you really need 2 doses. The stewardess actually did have 1 dose. She had 1 shot. She never got her second dose. And so you're supposed to get 1 dose around the age of 1, and then a booster around the age of 4 to 5. And the vaccine effectiveness is, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's something like 95% or 98% effective if you get 2 doses, and it drops down to 80-something or 90%. So you really should have the second shot, and she he had the one shot and not the second, and
as a child. As a child.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And but there is a fair amount of the virus in Israel. I mean, the three countries with the highest actually is the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, and Ukraine. So those are the three countries that have the largest number of reported cases. But there's a significant number in Israel, and like I mentioned with the Philippines now, there's a pretty significant number in the Philippines also. But the vast majority of the cases in the United States really originated in Israel. And like I said, the two ingredients you really need for the virus to spread is that A, somebody has to get infected to bring the virus in, and then B, they have to have contacts of people that where a significant number of those people have not been vaccinated. If they get at a higher level, the virus doesn't spread because it might go to the immediate family, but the other contacts will have been vaccinated, and the vaccine is very effective. So the measles example is kind of a sad story because the vaccine is in fact very effective and safe, and the vast majority of it's well above 95% in the United States, for instance, as a whole. But there are these pockets where the rate is lower, and that's where the virus has the opportunity to spread. That it really has to have a chance at a contact that hasn't been vaccinated. The vaccinated ones, it's very unlikely that those people are going to get the disease, and the virus is going to fall away. So that's the second area. Now the third one is yet another virus that causes a serious disease, is causes a polio-like virus. And your listeners might remember this. This kind of started in the United States back in 2014, and children were coming down with a polio-like disease. And the initial cases were out in California, and physicians there kind of looked at those cases, and they found that a few of them had a virus designated as D68. It's an enterovirus, and it's in the same category as polio. So it's similar to polio. The names of these viruses, I got a letter and a number because there's a lot of variations. They're all kind of the same class. The coronaviruses, pico is little, and RNA virus, so that's where their names come from. So they're a small virus, but polio is a coronavirus, and that is another example of an effective vaccine. Polio is been eliminated from the United States. In fact, it's been eliminated from most of the world. There's places like Pakistan where they kill healthcare workers distributing the virus there. So there are a few countries that don't have a high enough vaccination rate. The big
historical footnote to the effective polio vaccine was the tragic contamination of it early on, as you know, with SV40, which I've read a lot of different material on it. A lot of people died from that, unfortunately. Yeah. The years later.
Well, that was back in how they grew the virus, and
that's right.
Basically they screened the cell lines now much better to make sure they're pathogen free, and that's one of the hazards of new technologies. When they first start out, there's some things that the cell and the virus grew well, but so there's more precautions to prevent opportunistic infections from agents that get into the cell line. So they screen them a lot more carefully. But in this case, I mean, the story of this of this outbreak is just bizarre because they came out with this D68 back in 2014, and there were quite a few. They ended up with 120 confirmed cases then. And then, somewhat surprisingly, the next year there were only 22 cases. So, it looked like for whatever reason the virus really didn't take hold, and it didn't, it wasn't that big of a deal. But then the year after, it jumped back up again. There were even more than the first case. In 2016, there were 149. And then it fell down to 35 the next year, and then it went up to 235 in 2018. And so far this year, there's only been 13 cases, but it's a little early. It's a virus that normally happens over the summer, and there's a little bit of a lag between the time you get infected and then. Most children that get infected with the virus, have a very mild disease and they fully recover, but a small percentage do end up getting these one or more limbs develops paralysis, and they're basically paralyzed, and that's when they test them, and part of the reason the story is bizarre is most of the children test negative for the virus, but the reason they test negative for the virus is kind of the mechanism is they get infected with the virus, and then the virus ends up spreading and is somewhat neurotropic, so it goes into neurological tissues, and then they go and they mount an immune response to the virus, and that immune response not only kills the virus, but it tends to attack some of the cells that are the neurological cells that the virus is in. And then they develop these paralysis, and then they start being tested. And by the time that happens, the immune system's kind of cleared out the virus. And so when they start looking for the virus, they don't find the virus at a high frequency. And I think it's because they didn't find the virus at a high frequency that they stopped saying that it was due to D68, that it was due to this enterovirus. And they said it was, they put it back in this mystery disease, an unknown agent. They don't know exactly what causes it. And, it was kind of a ridiculous kind of statement. I mean, they're basically taking negative data. And the fact they couldn't find the virus is kind of well known why they couldn't find the virus. And it's the same thing even with polio. I mean, they didn't find the polio virus in every case that had the polio, but they found the virus in enough of the cases that they knew that polio was causing it. And when they developed the polio vaccine and basically got the vaccination rate high enough so the virus couldn't spread, nobody got polio again. So it was definitely the virus that was causing the polio, and it was causing polio the same way these children have their paralysis. That It was kind of the immune response to the virus that causes the symptoms of the disease. And so...
we have just about 5 minutes, Henry, just so you know.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, just wrapping up. So the reason this is news today is not because there's only been 13 cases this year, because it's an odd year and there aren't supposed to be a lot of cases this year. It's supposed to be a lot of cases next year. But they actually did a study where instead of trying to find the virus, they developed an assay that they could find antibodies to the virus. And so when they used that study, they could take the cerebral spinal fluid and test to see whether that fluid had antibodies to the virus. And they used another virological disease called Kawasaki disease as a control. And when they did that, it was a limited number, but it was dramatic enough that in the Kawasaki cases, they didn't find any enteroviruses, and in the cases that had the paralysis, they tested 14 and 11 had enterovirus, and 6 out of the 11 were the D68. There's another related virus called A71 that's been isolated from some of the U.S. cases also. But so it's news that now they're starting to say, well, it looks like it probably was D68 because that's the most common one they found in cases that have the paralysis. And it wasn't that they found the virus, and most of them, I think they only found the virus in one of the cases, but they found antibodies to at least enterovirus in 11 out of 14 and D68 in 6 out of the 14. And so they've kind of come to the conclusion that it really is a virus, and it really is the virus fades away, so their assay for the virus really doesn't work that well. And the pattern is indicative of a virus. It's kind of a virus that's widespread and causes a lot of disease, and then those that are infected develop antibodies to it, and the next year the number of cases goes down fairly dramatically, but then they get a variant that comes out that escapes the immune response, and the numbers go up the following year. So every even year it keeps getting higher, 120, then 149, then 235. And so the highest number is expected for next year, not necessarily for this year. So that was the other piece of news on the infectious disease front. Now, I was just going to mention that
2 minutes.
The DNA technology is becoming more commonly used for looking at people that have susceptibility to different medical conditions. And all of us, that's the program that nationwide are trying to enlist about 1 million people and do sequencing to have more personalized kind of medicine, and look at some of the underserved groups that aren't as well covered with some of the commercial tests. And they actually just came out with an article in the New England Journal of Medicine saying how many have been recruited. I think it's about 270,000 have been recruited so far. And so those tests are becoming much more common, and they're spreading a little bit into more medical applications. Many of your listeners are most familiar with it on solving cold cases because they can identify relatives.
There have been some pretty stunning resolutions of cold cases, too. I guess more in the works.
And it works well, and they have these these shows on TV about older cases, and you watch these cases, and it's kind of like, they got cold, they didn't have anything for 20 years, and then they got this tip or something came up, and they ended up solving it. And it's kind of like, in most of the cases, they've got DNA samples. And, especially if they're like serial rapists, they know that the rapes are being carried out by the same person. But they didn't really have the technology, whereas today they do. And so that'll be much more common in these cold cases.
So we've got a roll here, but are you recommending that people have these DNA tests for fun, if not for any other reason? But there may be another reason.
No, they're quite useful, and that is going to be the way of the future. Like I said, this program is to enroll 1 million people and to get better correlations. There's new correlations that come up, almost daily, where they've got another marker that's associated with this other, predisposition. And, there's enough diversity out there that you really kind of need significant testing on large populations to divide those populations up. And, it'll be the same thing for treatment where, they'll have a drug that'll work, but it'll only work on 20% of the population. But you could identify whether you're in the 20% that the drug's going to work based upon what your genetic composition is.
Very good.
So, yes, I would recommend those tests. They're very useful.
Take care.